Hi, this is Dr. Jenn Kennedy, and I wanted to come on today and talk a bit about women's sexuality and more specifically, lesbian sexuality as sort of a subset of women. So it's Gay Pride Month, and I figured it would be a perfect time to add this information. This is mostly information that I have distilled during my work on my dissertation, which is specifically about clinical work in sex therapy with lesbian women. So let's start by kind of setting like the larger table in terms of things that affect women's sexuality. The main elements that go into that camp are body image, family of origin, makes sense, right? The family that you grew up in, your age, your trauma history, and that could be big T or little t trauma, the culture that you are part of, and that can be lots of different definitions of culture, but mostly like the community or the religious community or the types of culture that you have around you. Attachment, which is often determined usually by family of origin and caregivers. So how were you cared for and how much were your needs met in that family of origin? Because that is going to show up in terms of how you are in partnership, how much you trust, etc. And lastly, what is your relationship to yourself and to pleasure? Because how you feel about those things matters, and how much you are willing to tune in and to tap in and to turn towards somebody is going to be affected. Now, this is all women. These elements, come into play with all women. So those are factors that are influencing women. Now, if we kind of look at even a smaller subset, and that would be same-sex attracted women, specifically lesbian, because the data was actually different on bisexual women. So those that primarily identify as only same-sex attracted, so not bisexual women. And the data looks a little bit different because there are different dynamics at play, as you can imagine. So looking specifically at elements that affect this population, I wanted to kind of break some of those down in this video today. So first of all would be social stigma. If you imagine that it is not yet, we are not yet a society where people can just be who they are, right? If you're in California, it's very different than, say, if you're in Florida. If you're in a state where people are more accepting, if you're in a community, if you're in a family, if you're in a religion, the optics look different. And in terms of all the way from when you're in school to when you're out in the working world to when you're trying to be a parent, the stigma around that, it's different based on where you are, who you are, and how you interpret the messages that are coming to you. But those are stressors that don't exist for heterosexual people. They're just different, right? It's just an added layer. A second element that should be considered is coming out. So coming out is not a single event. Like there is definitely like, when did you come out, right? That would be the first time is the end of that sentence, because queer people come out over and over and over again, right? They have to let you know who they are. And oftentimes it's not apparent that a woman is a lesbian. So she might have to come out to her employer, or she might have to come out to new friends, or she might have to come out, in all sorts of various contexts. And that adds stress because there's never a guarantee as to how it's going to land and how you are going to be received and how that changes your relationship to others. And so that's just another element that affects the relationship and the comfortability and therefore their sex life. It matters. A third element I wanted to touch on today is power dynamics. So if you imagine, again, in our larger societal sort of context, that often men get assigned certain roles and women get assigned different roles, whether you agree with those or not. But those are just sort of culturally what we expect. And that could be everything from like the guy pays the bill, to the woman is responsible for getting birth control, right? There's just like all kinds of things that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes get communicated as expectations. So when both partners are women, there's invariably going to be lots of things that need to be negotiated. And that plays out in the bedroom too. That plays out in all contexts. But in terms of who takes initiative, who's responsible for finances, who who determines what, everything. And this is male same-sex relationships too, but there's power dynamics that are different in terms of, you know, do we like the same things? Do we like things that are complementary to one another? So say two women both like oral sex, but they like giving oral sex. That doesn't work out so well if they are partnered, right? One needs to like to give while the other one likes to receive, or hopefully both. But you need to also negotiate sort of what are your needs, and are they complementary to the other, and the expectations, do they work together? So the power dynamics are just unique and different. These are just additional like considerations. The last thing I want to touch on that was interesting in the data was sex versus intimacy. Now, what I discovered is that, first of all, sex is defined differently by women in same sex relationships. So if you imagine, like, oftentimes when data gets recorded, especially when it's related to sex, it's all about penetration being the key word that changes it from sex to non sex. Well, between two women, there might not be any penetration, but they might still consider it sex. So it's different, right? And so the definition is much broader. Now, statistically, it's also been shown that women in relationships with women are more satisfied sexually. So the data gets a little skewed because how do you define sex? But when sex is happening, they tend to report feeling more satisfied. And that is because typically those women in relationship with one another sexually are taking their time. They're taking much more time in that process and in that adventure. So the goal, because they aren't so goal driven towards just orgasm, rather it's a whole exchange between the two parties. And so it tends to be more satisfying and mutually beneficial, whether there's penetration or not. So lesbians tend to look toward intimacy. They prioritize intimacy above sex, if that makes sense. These are just differences, but it's kind of interesting. And I do think that there's some information there that would actually be really helpful, is really helpful to my clients who are heterosexual and homosexual, right? It's like, how do you extrapolate some of this information that matters to everybody? So I hope this has been useful. Happy Pride Month, and I hope you watch more of my videos, and you can always learn more about me at pleasureproject.us.